Okay, class, welcome to your notes on the nervous system. This is still a part of Unit 2, 2A, what we're looking at. This is specifically going to show the breakdown of the nervous system, and then the second half is going to get into the endocrine system. So let's begin. Okay, your nervous system is broken apart into a variety of different branches. And I would probably stop, pause, and make sure you have this chart somewhere in your notes. You have the nervous system breaks down into two central areas, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. You then have the peripheral nervous system, which breaks down into the autonomic and somatic. And then finally, you have the autonomic that breaks down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So what is particularly the nervous system? The nervous system consists of all the nerve cells. It's the body's spiely electrochemical communication system. It's how basically your brain sends messages throughout the body. You have the peripheral nervous system, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the central nervous system, CNS. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So let's take a look at the central nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain, which we will spend all next week going in detail on, and the spinal cord. It also has neural networks. Neural networks are interconnected neurons that form networks in the brain. These networks are complex and modify with growth and experience. Another thing our brain allows us to do and has is what's known as plasticity. Our brain is able to change, adapt, earlier when we're in the childhood stages, and as we kind of grow up, our brain is adapting, restructuring, okay? And then a lot of the times our brains can adapt really well after there's damage to it, and it begins to grow new pathways. Again, this is just the basis for the central nervous system. We will go into a lot more details on the central nervous system next week. Moving on now, we're still kind of under the branch of the nervous system. We're looking at the peripheral nervous system, PNS. This is the sensory and motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. So once the inner neurons leave the central nervous system, sensory neurons and the motor neurons are what kind of make up the peripheral nervous system. They're responsible for sending the messages to the brain and from the brain to the rest of the body. And we talked about sensory neurons and motor neurons in class. So it's also made up of, besides sensory neurons and motor neurons, it's made up of nerves. Nerves consist of neural cables containing many axons. They are part of the peripheral nervous system. They connect the muscles, glands, the senses of organs to the rest of the central nervous system. So on this drawing here of this man, you have a bunch of little yellow cables. Okay, these cables are what carry the messages all the way from the bottom of your toes, okay, to the spinal cord. The spinal cord then is part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord then takes the messages to the brain. Okay, so when the neurons, the inner neurons, send it down the spinal cord, okay, it's then going to go maybe particularly to a motor neuron, so your knee will jerk or your toes will move. There's different branches of the peripheral nervous system, as you can see here. You have somatic, which controls the voluntary movements of the skeletal muscles. Here it says it's the division of the peripheral nervous system that enables voluntary control of your body's skeletal muscles. So this is kind of like if I said that you're going to swing at a bat. Okay, moving your arm back and forth, those are your skeletal muscles in order to swing the bat. The autonomic controls the self-regulated actions of internal organs and glands. They automatically happen. You don't necessarily have to think about it. Okay, it's part of the peripheral nervous system that controls the glands and other muscles. For example, it might be your heartbeat. So if I gave you an example that said, Katie wrote the answers on the test, she's most likely using the somatic nervous system. If I said Katie used her right hand to open the door, again, she's probably using the somatic nervous system. If I said Katie is digesting her lunch, she's most likely using the autonomic nervous system. If I said Katie was blinking, okay, you might say a little bit back and forth, but it's probably the autonomic nervous system. You pretty much do that without thinking. So the autonomic nervous system is then broken apart into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is the division of the autonomic nervous system that arouses the body, mobilizes its energy in stressful situation. So sympathetic, it gets you ready for a dangerous situation or if you have to move. And then the parasympathetic is the division of the autonomic nervous system that calms the body down. It conserves its energy. So here's an image of the different roles of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is often known as the fight or flight response. Okay, if you were to get attacked, you could either fight and defend yourself or flight and fly away. All right, so different things that the sympathetic nervous system does is it helps dilate your pupils, it accelerates your heartbeat, it inhibits digestion. The reason why it inhibits digestion is because it's conserving energy for a lot of the other things that need it for survival, like accelerating the heartbeat and dilating the pupils. Okay, it stimulates glucose for energy. Okay, it stimulates the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which helps with heartbeat. Okay, and then it also stimulates the ejaculation in males. So these are all things, the arousing state that the sympathetic nervous system does. The parasympathetic stages, that's going to be the stages that is the calming stage. Okay, it contracts the pupils, it slows the heartbeat down, it stimulates. Here is where it stimulates digestion because it doesn't need to conserve its energy for survival. So it can process digestion, it stimulates the gallbladder, contracts the bladder, and it allows blood to flow to the sex organs. All right. Big thing I always have students confuse is the digestion when that takes place, because it's kind of opposite of what you would think. If we're talking about arousing for sympathetic, you would think that digestion is going to be taking place, but it's actually the opposite. Okay, it inhibits digestion because it wants to conserve the energy. And then for the parasympathetic, it stimulates digestion. So here I would think of rest and digest both occur for the parasympathetic. So these are confusing pairs that students sometimes get mixed up. So make sure you're able to tell the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic. I also think of parasympathetic, you're with a pair, and that's why you can remain calm. Okay, the second part of the notes is going to look at the endocrine system. Kind of something to think about. Is your endocrine system your best friend or your worst enemy? So what is the endocrine system? The endocrine system is the body's slow chemical communication system. So it still sends messages just like the nervous system, but it does so in a slower pattern. Okay, communication is carried out by hormones synthesized by a set of glands. So instead of traveling in nerves, it travels in neurons, it travels in hormones in the bloodstream. I would take a look at page 29, and I would also stop, pause it, and maybe write down the different parts that you would be responsible for knowing and locating where they are. So starting at the top, the hypothalamus is part of the brain that controls the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is a gland and secretes many different hormones, some which are responsible for growth. Then you have the thyroid and the parathyroids. Okay. The thyroid affects metabolism, among other things, and the parathyroid helps regulate the calcium in the blood. The adrenal glands are the inner parts called the medulla, helps trigger the fight or flight response. So if you are in danger, this is the one that's going to kind of rev up that sympathetic nervous system. The pancreas regulates the level in blood. And then you have the testicles and the ovaries, which are the places where the male and female hormones are created. We are going to go into a lot more detail in the endocrine system throughout the different units, but it's good to know the basis of the different parts right now. So hormones, as I kind of spoke about, are chemicals that are synthesized by the endocrine glands. They are secreted in the bloodstream. Hormones affect the brain and many other tissues of the body. Hormones versus neurotransmitters. So there could be a question on there to understand the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are created in the neuron, and the nervous systems travel via the nervous system. Hormones are created by the glands and travel via the bloodstream. They're similar. Hormones are identical to neurotransmitters and flow the same process to send the messages. They differ because the nervous system is quick, the endocrine system is slow, and the messages are traveling in the bloodstream. The pituitary gland is often known as the master gland. The pituitary releases the different hormones and that regulate other glands. Hypothalamus, we will talk about more next week, but the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. It's a structure in the brain. The thyroid and the parathyroid, we kind of talked about before, they regulate the metabolic and calcium rates. The adrenal glands help trigger the fight or flight, and they release hormones that increase your heart rate, blood pressure, and sugar. You have the pancreas is the organ that regulates blood sugar. Gonads are the sex glands that are located in different places, men and women. They regulate the bodily development and maintain reproductive organs in older adults, ovaries for the female or testicles for the male. Okay, we will look in more detail at ovaries create women's sex hormones and secrete estrogen. Testes create male sex hormones and secrete androgens. So that is our summary on the nervous system. Make sure you know the different branches of the nervous system and the roles of each of the branches. And the endocrine system, make sure you know what a hormone is and the different structures in the endocrine system.